Joined by someone with an incredible amount of experience in these affairs, a man who knows China very well. He's also served as an intelligence officer with Australia's Defence Intelligence Organisation, specialising in China. He's now an author, academic and commentator. He joins me live from Melbourne. Paul Monk, thanks for joining us. We agreed to have this conversation yesterday, and then all this news broke overnight. Extraordinary revelations.
It is. There's a great deal breaking at the moment, of course. The case of Nick Zhao, the question of Wang Lijiang, the election results in Hong Kong, the leaks about the Xinjiang papers from China. It's all happening at once. And for an old China hand, it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, well, tell me your take on this. I said at the outset of the program that while the detailed revelations here are quite shocking, we shouldn't be surprised. We have been warned by intelligence agency chiefs, former intelligence agency chiefs, experienced politicians and the like that China was trying to interfere in our democracy. And in fact, we've had cyber attacks and cases of involvement in university campuses. So just how surprised are you at what's unfolding as we speak?
I'm not particularly surprised. I think what's interesting is that at last some concrete evidence has come to the surface, because I think many of Australia's citizens, accustomed to a more open society and wary of paranoia, have been thinking to themselves, is this overblown? Is this real, or is this imaginary? And you've had a number of public figures, most recently Paul Keating, dismissing it as paranoia and phobia. And right on the back of him saying that, we learn of this individual who was being positioned to go into Parliament, but his conscience, let's say, got the better of him. He went to Asia and he winds up dead. So it's quite a dramatic case. It would make a good spy novel, wouldn't it?
How confident are you that the investigation of that death will be transparent, will get to the bottom of what went on?
I think it's highly likely that it will, for two reasons. One is that our institutions are now closely focused on trying to get this matter clear. That is the general matter, as distinct from the specific case. And for that reason, they're applying the appropriate resources to it. But more fundamentally, their integrity is at stake now. If they flub this, if they try and brush it under the carpet in order to appease China, it's going to make waves. And it won't serve their cause simply as institutions, much less the national interest of this country. So I expect this will come out. But what I would also expect is that our government will nevertheless remain even-tempered about the finding, and will more quietly and diplomatically than angrily rebuke the Communist Party for this attempt to infiltrate our institutions. We have then, in this instance, some evidence to hold up and say, look, it's real, so we need to talk Turkey about this.
Paul Monk, given your experience of intelligence agencies and China in particular, do you believe it's possible that Chinese intelligence agencies have murdered this man in Australia, an Australian citizen, because he was a man they attempted to compromise and because they knew he was speaking to ASIO?
I think it's entirely possible. Let's remind ourselves that the Putin government in Russia has murdered several people who've defected from Russia and spilled the beans on that regime. And the Chinese Communist Intelligence Service and propaganda apparatus is more ambitious and larger than that of Putin. So if an operation was compromised, as this appears to have been, by their own man going to ASIO, I can well imagine they were aggrieved. But let's hope that what's occurred is that the truth comes out and this embarrasses them, and perhaps, unlike Putin, they pull in their head a bit and become a little more restrained.
Well, the area of espionage always is dramatic when it comes to the surface, and this is particularly spectacular and egregious, as you suggest. But of course, Australia runs spies. Our friendly nations like the US run spies. We would fully expect a large superpower like China to be running espionage operations. We would be spying on China to some degree. We would expect them to spy on us. What's different about what's going on now when it comes to China and intelligence and its outreach, and how much of it can be hinged, I suppose, or how much of it hinges on the changing dynamic in Beijing, the rule of Xi Jinping and how he has changed the Communist Party in China?
That's a big question. So perhaps the simplest answer is to say that, yes, espionage is conducted by almost every country in order to have, shall we say, sharper antennae for emerging dangers or attempts to endanger the security of their country. And so it's not altogether untoward that there are intelligence officers working. We have declared intelligence officers, so does China. South Korea, an ally and friend, has intelligence officers here. What becomes a matter of more concern is when there are undeclared officers, and in particular when they are starting to do the kinds of things that the Chinese intelligence agents have been attempting to do in this country. So to draw a parallel, you know, we've been finding some evidence, as has the United States, of Chinese espionage. And occasionally we prosecute somebody, and when they're prosecuted, occasionally they're convicted. Sometimes on technicalities they get off. In China, a few years ago, they discovered a CIA spy network. Oh, shock horror, you know, as you say, that's to be expected. What happened? They shot 30 people. So they handle things differently in China. And what they've done here is they had somebody they were trying to manoeuvre into a favourable position to be their man inside the federal parliament. And when he went to ASIO saying, I think this is going too far, he winds up dead. So that's the kind of concern we have. Espionage can be done according to more or less tacit rules, and then it can be done the rough way. And China is getting a bit too rough.
All right, let's talk about the end game here. We know there's been Chinese interference at universities. They don't like people talking up, for instance, the independence of Taiwan against their foreign policy interests, I suppose. We know that they compromised Labor Senator Sam Dastyari, and they had Sam Dastyari spruiking basically China's foreign policy view on the South China Sea. So we can see how they'd like to influence foreign policy perspectives around the world through subversion in Australian democracy, I suppose. But what is their end game here? If you're talking about this level of subversion, this level of attempted interference in the Australian democracy, what does China want with us?
I think it's very clear that Xi Jinping and the party have made explicit statements for a number of years now that they see themselves as the natural predominant power in Asia and the Western Pacific. They seek to detach Australia from the US alliance and draw us into the orbit of their influence. And what that means is that our politicians would toe their party line. That's why they went so far recently as to rebuke Andrew Hastie and Jim Patterson and say that they've spoken out of school and must repent and redress before they'll be permitted to visit China. That kind of finger-wagging is symptomatic of the attitude that they have, that they're projecting, that they seek to entrench. And our sovereignty is therefore at stake. So we need to stand up in a dignified but very clear way and say, that's not going to happen, sorry.
Well, they have some very powerful voices in Australia, Australian voices in Australia, telling everybody to calm down, basically accepting a lot of what Beijing says, and it says Australia should be more relaxed about this relationship and some of these events. One of those, as we mentioned earlier, is former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating in that fascinating speech last week. Let's just have a look at another excerpt of what Paul Keating had to say.
I think it's true to say the United States remains the most ideological major society on earth. It believes as a nation and as a system it has the democratic formula and the universal values which it is committed to propagate. On the other hand, China's historical view is not rooted in ideological aspiration, universal or otherwise. This is not the Soviet Union. China is not exporting an ideology.
Your thoughts on that, Paul Monk? You've got Paul Keating basically admonishing America, really, for wanting to export values like democracy and freedom, but saying we don't need to worry about any ideological ambitions from China.
Yeah, look, to be blunt, that's pure nonsense. The United States has, of course, espoused liberal and democratic values and universal human rights, especially since the Second World War, and to the benefit of a vast number of people. We stood up against Nazism for that reason and against Japanese militarism. We fought the Cold War in order to uphold those values. And the Chinese Communist Party, in its ideology, and it's very ideological, has not bought into that. In arrant hypocrisy, it signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but none of them are available to Chinese citizens. And in fact, it's worth adding that even under Mao, the Chinese constitution guaranteed Chinese citizens freedom of assembly, expression, religion, etc. You try and exercise those rights then or now, and you soon wind up being beaten up or imprisoned and certainly censored. So Keating's statement there is just complete nonsense. If we don't stand up for universal human rights, then the abuses that are still widespread in the world go unchecked and unreproved. And it seems to me that's not in our interest. It's not in the interests of the persecuted peoples in many countries around the world, and it doesn't conduce to a more open and peaceful world order.
Well, it also raises the question of what's the point of Australia if we don't have values that we cherish?
Absolutely. And in fact, we do, of course, conduct open debates about various aspects of our history. But we need to remind ourselves that the main reason why Australia as a whole has long since been dubbed the lucky country is not because we hit pay dirt in terms of natural resources, though we did. It's because we inherited a liberal and utilitarian approach to public policy, to parliamentary politics, to freedom of speech, that have made us politically and in a sense philosophically more fortunate than most countries on the planet. And that is the legacy to uphold. When we debate about how we treat refugees or indeed how we come to terms with our Indigenous people, it's only in terms of those principles and open debate that we can resolve these things intelligently. If we would adopt the Communist Party of China's practice, we might round up all the remaining Indigenous and put them in camps like they've done with the Uyghurs. I don't recommend that.
Yeah, spot on. Let me just show you another snippet from Paul Keating last week.
My concern is what passes for the foreign policy of Australia lacks any sense of strategic realism, and that the whispered word communism of old is now being replaced by the word China.
Yeah, the threat of communism replaced by the threat of China. But the issue here is surely, Paul Monk, Chinese communism. It's not the Chinese people, the Chinese economy, but Chinese communism ought to be viewed as a threat to Australia's interests, shouldn't it?
Well, it is. And moreover, he has it exactly wrong. The concern we have is not with China per se. We're very happy to trade with China. Many of us love Chinese food. Many of us are impressed by ancient Chinese wisdom, porcelain, art. You know, there's not a problem with China. The problem is with the Chinese Communist Party. And with Xi Jinping specifically, for 30 years, we and other Western countries have invested in China, traded with China, talked with China, bent over backwards to draw it into the international trading order on liberal principles. And China has benefited enormously from that. Under Xi Jinping, the hopes we'd had that would slowly and surely lead to an opening up and liberalising of their institutions, economic as well as political, have been thwarted. Xi Jinping's going in the opposite direction. He's entrenching mercantilism. He's entrenching dictatorship. He's creating an unprecedented regime of surveillance, censorship and oppression. He's rounding up vast numbers of the peoples in Xinjiang and putting them in concentration camps. This is going in exactly the opposite direction to the way we hoped. And it is not something we can just stand idly by and say, oh, well, this is just China. This is the Communist Party of China, and that's the problem.